Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the presentation. Everyone's here. So we have a double header today, two interns going back to back. We're going to start with Joe Krell. I'm pleased to introduce Joe Krell. Joe got a BS in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from University of Rochester, where he received a number of scholarships, including one for his work on thermal tolerance of social wasps. But in addition to his degree, he worked to become an Eagle Scout, presided over the university running club, played the baritone saxophone in the jazz ensemble, and also co-founded the university's birding club. Since then, Joe has worked a little more on social insects, but this time in the Galapagos, and then as a Conservation Corps crew member in Utah. Maybe he was trying to get away from the ocean as much as possible there. When Joe applied for the internship, I reached out to Nancy Chen, who is a collaborator and works at University of Rochester. She told me that Joe was nerdy, hardworking, very smart, but quiet. This was her text. I looked it up, and she wasn't wrong. It's hard to find someone who is so attentive and thoughtful yet so quiet. Joe always volunteers for the hardest work and is always game to chase a new life bird. Joe's project required him to set up a really fun field experiment and then go through the rigors of trying to do a behavioral experiment with wild animals. When working with birds, sometimes you screw something up, sometimes the birds don't cooperate, and sometimes your machine like equipment fails. So Joe spent a pretty fair amount of time in the evenings when the other interns are back in the lodge, actually out in the field testing his ideas. So I welcome Joe here to come share his wonderful study, which I've heard he'll present as an interpretive piece on the baritone saxophone. I'm just kidding.
So I'm going to be talking about territoriality in the Florida scrub jay today. Territoriality is common in birds, and that's because having a territory ensures that an individual defending it will have access to really important resources in that space. And as a result, possession of a territory is required to breed in a lot of species. One of those species is the Florida scrub jay, which is a cooperatively breeding bird. They live in groups of breeders, helpers, and juveniles. Helpers typically being kids that stick around for a year or two before they become breeders of their own, and they help raise their siblings. And it's a federally threatened species restricted to oak scrub in Florida. And the scrub jays defend large territories, on average 20 to 25 acres. And these territories are often adjacent to one another, so they'll have these boundaries between territories. And possession of a territory is required to breed in the scrub jay. Population growth in the species only occurs in scrub of medium height, 1 to 2 meters on average. And very short and very tall scrub are considered suboptimal habitat. And the scrub is maintained by fire at the site. And the jays harvest acorns from oaks in the scrub, and they cache these in open sandy patches. And these acorns are a really important resource for them during fall and winter. So here's an example of what some optimal scrub could look like. Again, 1 to 2 meters in height and dominated by oaks. And you can see on the right there, there's a bit of a sandy patch. Maybe they will cache some acorns there. And here's some suboptimal habitat. Maybe it was scrub at one point, but hasn't burned in a while. So now it looks like this. And what's important though is that this could still be part of a jay territory, and they could still defend something like they do defend something like this, even though it's not optimal scrub. So I want to know whether jays are more defensive of territory boundaries that fall in optimal scrub than the boundaries that fall in suboptimal habitat. And I predicted that they would because these optimal scrub boundaries delineate the really important acorn resources and foraging habitat. And in a big territory, they can only defend so much at a given time, and it makes sense to defend these optimal scrub boundaries. I also want to know what social factors are driving J territoriality. And I predicted that breeders and groups with helpers would defend more strongly than groups without helpers, because some groups have helpers and some don't in any given year. And I was also interested in this idea of the familiarity of neighbors, because J groups are, as I said, adjacent to one another often. These birds, a lot of them know who their neighbors are. They have they're next to the same territory for several years in many cases, and they know who's on the other side of the boundary. And I predicted that groups at boundaries with more familiar neighbors would defend less strongly, and groups with less familiar neighbors would defend more strongly, because the more familiar neighbors have had more time to better establish these territory boundaries. So I tested this by doing a call playback experiment, which is when you broadcast the vocalizations of an animal into the environment and observe how they respond. So with the jays, I played territorial scrub jay calls, which sound like this. And what that's like. And I did this in along boundaries in optimal and suboptimal habitat, and I observed how the breeders responded. So I did it at 14 optimal and 14 suboptimal boundaries, and I did 3 trials at each during April and May, during the breeding season, during the time when they're most territorial. And I categorized the response as 0, 1, or 2. 0 being no response, 1 being the breeders flew in and perched up at the boundary, and then 2 being vocalizing directly at the speaker, also maybe flying up and down the boundary. They do that as well. And I was able to do this because we have at Archbold a fully color banded population of scrub jays, so we know who's who. And I knew where the boundaries are because each year the Bird Lab maps the jay territories, which you can see here on the right. The black lines are the jay territories, and you can see they're all kind of clustered there. And the 4-letter codes there are the names of jay groups. And then the red squares are where I did trials. So for the social factor part of this, I was able to know which groups have helpers and which do not, looking at the monthly census that we take for the jays here at Archbold. So we know who's who and who's in which group, and we know which groups have helpers and which ones do not. And for the familiarity of neighbors, I looked at the annual territory maps, and you can see a few of them printed out there in that photo. And what I looked at is the number of years that each pair of jay groups at a given boundary that I tested have shared a boundary. So I looked at just the number of years that the 2 groups have shared a boundary in their adjacent territories. And that ranged from 0 to 6 years. To analyze my results, I did a cumulative link mixed model, which is a type of generalized linear mixed model designed to handle ordinal data. And here's what I found. I found that territorial response was stronger at boundaries in optimal scrub habitat. And as a reminder, this is on the y-axis there, that's using the 0, 1, or 2 score of the territorial response averaged as a mean. And I found that territorial response was stronger in groups with helpers than without helpers. I found that boundaries with higher neighbor stability had a stronger territorial response than groups with lower neighbor stability. And I had lower neighbor stability as being 0, 1, or 2 years that they've shared that boundary, and then higher neighbor stability being 3 to 6 years. And these results largely match what I predicted for the most part. I think that the strongly defended optimal scrub boundaries, those are protecting the really important acorn resources, as well as other foraging habitat and maybe potential nesting sites as well. And those are just critical to the jays. And the breeders and groups with helpers responding more strongly, that also makes a lot of sense based on what we know about the benefits of having helpers. Group territory defense is one of those benefits, and having more birds in a group means that you can better defend the nest and the territory, and the breeders are freer to respond to intrusions in the territory. Now, the neighbor familiarity or neighbor stability part of this, that was a little surprising, but the fact that the more familiar neighbors responded more strongly, I would attribute that to the fact that the individuals that you heard on that playback track calling are unfamiliar to all of the jays on station currently. And this was by design. I didn't want individuals hearing familiar individuals and then responding differently because of that. These are calls that were recorded in the 90s. So it might have been alarming for some of the more stable boundaries, the neighbors there, to hear unfamiliar individuals calling. That's what I would attribute that to. I also found that the response was weaker with each subsequent try, as in 2 was weaker than 1 and 3 was weaker than 2. And I think that this makes sense given that these are smart birds, and they heard this simulated intrusion 3 times over a couple months, and they weren't seriously seeing where those calls were coming from, or the birds, the intrusions were coming from, and so they might have perceived it to be less of a threat with each passing trial. I did test to see whether the response of a group was correlated with whether the other group on the other side of the boundary in reality was actually there during that trial, and it was not, which for the purposes of my analysis was good, because I was considering each of the groups to be separate a data point. And there's a lot of opportunities for further research here. I think it would be really interesting to look at each boundary, the response at each boundary for a given territory, because I just tested 1 boundary per territory to maximize the number of groups that I visited. But a given territory might have really great habitat on one side, really great scrub, and then some suboptimal habitat on the other side, and then maybe they have no J group at all on another side. So it'd be interesting to see how they kind of prioritize where they defend and where they spend their time. Also, it would be really cool to use LiDAR to look at not just habitat quality as being optimal or suboptimal, but also looking at just the general habitat structure as more of a spectrum and different geographical features like wetlands or even roads, and how that affects their territorial behavior. And so there are a lot of people I want to thank, especially everyone in Bird Lab. I feel very fortunate to have worked with such a great team. I also want to thank the Jays for their participation. They were really the best. And I will take questions. Yes.
I thought it was a really cool talk, and I was wondering about the neighbors. I'm kind of, I would think that there'd be an element of relatedness with the neighbors, and I'm not sure you mentioned that, but because a lot of times when they like butt off, and so their neighbors may be actual relatives, and I wonder if that played any role in your study.
Yeah, that's a great question. I did, when I was deciding which territories, which boundaries to test. I did do my best to avoid testing boundaries that are directly related individuals. So I tried to avoid having a group on one side that's the kid of the group on the other side. So, you know, they might be more distantly related, hopefully, yeah, but I don't, from what I saw, I don't think that did affect it. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah. Did you see any difference in response in how they defended the two different types of suboptimal habitat? The really low stuff versus the really tall stuff?
Yeah, great question. I mostly tested overgrown scrub. So I only had a few instances where it was very short. That would be something that I would like to look at more, because, you know, like part of a boundary that's going through a wetland, I expect that would have even a different response. But no, I didn't see a difference between the very short and the very tall.
I was just curious, how much do the birds think about that? Are they thinking ahead like we do?
Right.
You know, a couple years from now, this is gonna be great.
Yeah.
Versus this stuff over here is still gonna be bad.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, we see that, you know, the jays do tend to start fighting over recently burned scrub. So if it is very short, because it recently burned, that could have a strong response. Yeah. Yeah, Alec.
Was there any need to control for individual personalities amongst the birds, whether they just generally are more aggressive at defending their territories, or does that just come out in the wash with all the?
It's not something that I controlled for specifically, different personalities. But we certainly do see different personalities. I mean, I took precautions to avoid having the jays like see me before I started the trial and started the playback, so that they wouldn't be coming in and responding just because they, you know, are more friendly or something like that. Yeah, I mean, I think like there are different ways that I could have looked at and categorized the territorial response, and it would be interesting to break it down as kind of more specific responses that could account for different personalities. Yeah.
And you also restricted your things to April and May, right? When they're most territorial.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah. It was only in April and May.
Cool. That's very well.
More basic question, but how does the bird lab get such good data on the boundaries and know exactly like where those lines are?
Yeah, it's a really impressive operation I've seen. So I mean, they use behavioral cues of the breeders. So I'm sure Sas could explain better, but just looking at, you know, taking the breeders around and seeing how far we can get them to defend the boundary, and then dropping points, and you know, making the whole network and seeing where, you know, where how far you can pull a group till another group comes in, that kind of thing. And yeah, we're able to get accurate lines.
And you need to go mapping with me in April. You can see how there's literally, you can draw a line in the sand and they won't cross it. Steven.
More of a broader question, but how big of a change do you see from the 1 year to the next for the territories?
It can vary. I mean, there are some boundaries that are time honored boundaries and you know, stay pretty consistent year to year. But there is a lot of change. So yeah.
One thing I'll add is if the neighbors are the same individuals, they're often the same in the same place, the boundary. But if the neighbors are different, then they start moving. They try to usurp land as soon as one of the neighbors dies. Well, thank you, Joe.